October 14th, 1955. A secure room, deep beneath the limestone foundations of the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. The air is thick with the smells of stale cigarette smoke, sweat, and ozone from the humming electronic map boards. A single piece of paper sits under the harsh glare of a desk lamp. It is a translated intercept, a fragment of a Western Alliance after-action report from a recent field exercise, codenamed Operation Carte Blanche. The report is dry, technical. It speaks of simulated objectives and notional force deployments. Yet, to the grizzled marshals who read it, the words are a physical assault. One paragraph is circled in red grease pencil. It describes the simulated fate of the 7th Guards Tank Army. An entire armored fist, the pride of the Red Army, poised in the mock scenarios to smash through the Fulda Gap. The report states that the 7th Guards ceased to exist in 11 minutes. Not defeated, not attrited, erased. It was struck, the text reads, by a single battalion of artillery. 3 guns. The marshals read the sentence again. And again. The numbers do not compute. The physics is impossible. The very concept is an insult to the mathematics of war they have mastered. A low murmur fills the room. It is the sound of an entire military philosophy beginning to crack. An aide enters with a fresh pot of tea. He sees the faces of the marshals, men who broke the spine of the Wehrmacht, and he sees a look he has never witnessed before. It is not anger. It is not confusion. It is the cold, hollow dread of a man who has just seen a ghost of a future war they are utterly unprepared to fight. The senior marshal, a man whose chest is a solid wall of medals, taps the paper with a thick finger. He asks the question that will hang over the entire Soviet empire for the next decade. He does not shout. His voice is a low, dangerous whisper. What is it? No one answers. The map board hums its indifferent electronic song. On the vast table, the tiny red flags representing the glorious tank divisions of the Red Army suddenly look fragile. They look like kindling. The room is a tomb, and the piece of paper is the epitaph for a war that has not yet been fought, but has, in some fundamental way, already been lost. They were staring at an impossibility. A single artillery shell that did the work of 1,000 bombers. The initial event metastasizes. It transforms from a tactical anomaly into a strategic cancer. The foundation of Soviet military power rests on a simple, brutal equation: mass. Thousands of tanks. Millions of men. A tidal wave of steel and flesh designed to overwhelm any defense through sheer, inexorable pressure. This doctrine was not theory. It was gospel, written in the blood and fire of the Great Patriotic War. It was the hard-won lesson from the rubble of Stalingrad to the heart of Berlin. Now, that gospel is heresy. The Western Alliance has seemingly developed a weapon that renders mass irrelevant. Worse, it turns mass into a liability. A concentration of force, the very core of a Soviet offensive, is no longer a spearhead. It is a target. A single, juicy, irresistible target for this new phantom weapon. An entire armored division, the product of a nation's industrial might, the culmination of years of training and planning, can be annihilated not in a battle of days or weeks, but in the time it takes for a shell to travel from a cannon to a grid square. The implications ripple outward, poisoning every aspect of their strategic planning. How do you invade Western Europe if your primary offensive instrument can be vaporized at the start of the assault? The entire Warsaw Pact strategy, the buffer of satellite states, the forward deployment of armies, it all hinges on the credibility of that armored punch. Without it, the threat is hollow. The empire is a house of cards. The balance of power, so carefully managed with espionage, diplomacy, and brute industrial production, is now shattered. The West has not just built a better tank or a faster plane. They have changed the rules of the game. They have brought a computer to a knife fight. They have introduced a predator so lethal that the entire ecosystem of conventional warfare is thrown into chaos. The Soviet Union's vast arsenal of conventional forces, its primary lever of global influence, now seems like a magnificent, expensive, and utterly obsolete collection of iron dinosaurs. Among the troops and junior officers stationed in East Germany, the whispers begin. They have no access to the classified intercepts, but they see the changes. Formations are ordered to disperse to an almost ludicrous degree. sacrificing command cohesion and offensive concentration. New protocols are drilled, demanding crews dig their tanks into the earth at every halt, turning mobile fortresses into static pillboxes. The drills feel desperate. They feel like rituals meant to ward off an unseen evil. They give the weapon a name. They do not call it by a designation. They call it the Judge, or sometimes the Eraser. It is spoken of in hushed tones in mess halls and freezing guard posts. A myth takes root. A story of a cannon so vast it must be moved by multiple trains, a shell that carries the power of the sun. It is everywhere and nowhere. It can strike without warning. It is the embodiment of a technological terror they cannot see, cannot fight, and cannot understand. The fear is more corrosive than any radiation. It is the fear of absolute impotence. It is the dawning horror that the courage of the soldier and the genius of the commander mean nothing. The box does it. The shell decides. The order comes down from the highest level of the Presidium. It is simple. It is absolute. Find it. Understand it. Copy it. The full weight of the state's intelligence apparatus, a vast and fearsome machine, pivots to this single task. The GRU, the Military Intelligence Directorate, activates every asset it has in Western Europe. Spies who have lain dormant for years are given new, urgent taskings. Resources are diverted from tracking troop movements and political developments. The new priority is technology. Specialist teams are assembled in Moscow. They are composed of the best minds the system can produce. Artillery experts, nuclear physicists, metallurgists, and intelligence analysts. They are locked in secure facilities, tasked with assembling a puzzle from 1,000 disparate pieces. They are given everything. Every intercepted radio signal, every defector debriefing, every grainy photograph taken by high-altitude reconnaissance planes. The evidence trickles in. A source in a West German engineering firm provides schematics for a new, unusually large transport vehicle. It has 2 driver cabs, one at each end, and can pivot in the middle. It is designed to carry an immense load, far heavier than any known conventional artillery piece. Another agent, a clerk in a NATO logistics office, reports requisitions for bizarrely small numbers of enormous artillery shells, each one handled with the kind of security reserved for crown jewels. They are shipped in climate-controlled containers. They are guarded by elite troops. Pilots flying reconnaissance missions are ordered to hunt for these new units. They fly dangerous, provocative paths along the border, their cameras straining. They come back with tantalizing glimpses. A convoy of strange, long-bodied vehicles under heavy guard. A massive cannon barrel, shrouded in canvas, being emplaced in a remote, heavily defended forest clearing. The photographs are analyzed by armies of technicians, enlarged until the film grain is the size of a fist. The debriefings of captured agents and the interrogation of low-level Western soldiers yield more confusion. The crews of these new weapons are different. They are not artillerymen in the traditional sense. They are technicians. They are surrounded by scientists. The firing procedures are described as being more like a laboratory experiment or a missile launch than the firing of a simple gun. There are checks and cross-checks. There are coded authorizations that come from the highest levels of command. But the evidence is contradictory. The weapon is described as a cannon, an ancient and well-understood technology. Yet its effects are those of a strategic bomber carrying a city-killing weapon. The physics does not line up. A chemical explosive powerful enough to create such a blast would require a shell the size of a small building. It would be impossible to fire from any cannon. The fragments of data create not a clear picture, but a deeper, more profound mystery. The machine seems to break the known laws of science. It is a square circle. It is a contradiction in steel. The analysts in Moscow work themselves to the point of exhaustion, but the phantom remains stubbornly out of focus. It is a gun that acts like a bomb, a tactical weapon with strategic consequences. The more they learn, the less they understand. In the windowless rooms of the analysis centers, the best minds of the Soviet military-industrial complex begin their work. They are prisoners of their own experience. Their worldview is forged in the crucible of industrial warfare, a world of steel, chemistry, and ballistics. They take the strange, contradictory data and attempt to force it into a shape they can recognize. They must find an explanation that fits their universe. The first theory is the most straightforward. It is an act of denial. The weapon does not exist. The reports are a massive campaign of psychological warfare. The Americans, they reason, are masters of deception. They are projecting a phantom to paralyze Soviet will, to make the Red Army fear its own shadow. This theory is comforting. It suggests the enemy's strength is an illusion. But the physical evidence, the reconnaissance photos of the enormous cannons, the intelligence reports of specialized units, is too concrete to ignore. The theory collapses under the weight of reality. The second theory is more plausible, but still rooted in their own technological paradigm. They hypothesize a new form of chemical explosive, a binary agent, perhaps, where two stable compounds are mixed within the shell during its flight, creating a blast of unimaginable power. They call it hypercombustion. Teams of chemists and engineers are tasked with replicating this theoretical material. They spend months in their laboratories, mixing volatile compounds, running complex simulations. The effort produces nothing but dead ends and a few dangerous lab accidents. There is no chemical reaction that can produce that much energy from such a small volume. It violates the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. The third theory is a leap into the exotic. It suggests the Americans have weaponized some new branch of physics. Perhaps a scalar weapon that uses longitudinal waves to create destructive resonance in targets. Or a plasma vortex projector. These ideas are born from the fringes of theoretical science, a desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable. They sound more like science fiction than military analysis. This theory gains traction among those who believe the West has achieved a breakthrough so profound it rewrites the rules of science itself. It is a theory born of fear and a growing sense of intellectual inferiority. It is also completely, utterly wrong. A fourth theory emerges, focusing on the delivery system. They fixate on the gun itself. Perhaps, they argue, the gun is the real innovation. Maybe it uses electromagnetic rails to launch a projectile at hypersonic speeds, causing devastation through pure kinetic energy. This railgun theory explains the need for the massive, specialized carriage and the strange firing procedures. It aligns with their understanding of brute force. The investigation pivots to electromagnetism. Vast resources are poured into developing their own experimental railguns. The results are clumsy, power-hungry prototypes that can barely launch a small metal slug a few kilometers. They are decades away from a viable weapon. A fifth theory postulates a fuel-air explosive on a massive scale. The shell, they reason, does not carry its own oxidant. It disperses a cloud of fine fuel vapor over the target, which then ignites, creating a massive, rolling fireball and a devastating pressure wave. This is a known technology, but the scale required is immense. To create an explosion large enough to destroy a tank division would require a fuel cloud covering dozens of square kilometers. How could a single artillery shell deliver such a payload? The fluid dynamics are impossible. The sixth and most persistent wrong conclusion is what the analysts call the perfected conventional munition. This is the magic bullet fallacy in its purest form. They believe the Americans have simply perfected every single aspect of a conventional artillery shell. A perfect propellant, a perfect aerodynamic shell casing, a perfect fuse, and a perfect high-explosive filler. They assume the West has achieved 100 small, incremental improvements that, when combined, produce a revolutionary effect. This is the most dangerous theory of all, because it is the most believable. It keeps them trapped in their own technological prison. It sends their own weapons designers down a futile path of incremental refinement, trying to build a better cannonball while the enemy is learning to harness the atom. Based on these flawed theories, a series of futile countermeasures are devised and implemented. To counter the theoretical hypercombustion shell, new armor configurations are designed for their tanks. Applique armor plates and experimental composite materials are rushed into production. The tanks become heavier, slower, and less reliable. They are no more survivable against the real weapon than their predecessors. To counter the railgun theory, they focus on camouflage and concealment. If the weapon relies on direct line of sight and kinetic impact, then hiding the targets is paramount. This leads to the absurd dispersal of forces, breaking up the powerful armored formations into small, isolated units that are easier to hide but impossible to command effectively. They have sacrificed their greatest strength, concentration of force, to defend against a weapon that does not exist. To counter the fuel-air explosive theory, they issue new defensive protocols. Tank crews are ordered to seal their vehicles and engage their internal air filtration systems the moment an artillery barrage is suspected. This does nothing to protect them from a blast wave that can crush a T-series tank into a metal can. It only serves to increase the paranoia and exhaustion of the frontline troops. Every one of these countermeasures is a step in the wrong direction. Each one is a testament to a profound and systemic failure to understand the nature of the threat. They are fighting a phantom of their own creation. They are shadowboxing in the dark. While the marshals in Moscow stare at their maps in horrified confusion, the answer is being assembled in a place that could not be more different. It is not a grim, smoke-filled bunker. It is a sun-drenched laboratory in the high desert of New Mexico. It is a quiet office in the sprawling complex of the Pentagon. It is a noisy factory floor in Watervliet, New York. The answer is not a single invention. It is a system. It is a philosophy. The story begins in the final days of the Second World War. The scientists of the Manhattan Project, having created a weapon that could end civilizations, immediately began to ponder a new question. Could the atom be tamed? Could its immense power be scaled down? Could a nuclear device be made small enough, precise enough, to be used on a battlefield without incinerating the entire continent? The strategic bomber had delivered the first atomic bombs. But the military's leadership, particularly in the army, looked at the coming confrontation with the Soviet Union's massive land armies and saw a problem that bombers alone could not solve. They needed to stop tank divisions in the Fulda Gap, not just flatten cities. The challenge was immense. The early atomic bombs were behemoths. They were handcrafted laboratory instruments, weighing several tons, requiring a massive B-29 bomber to carry just one. To shrink that device into something that could fit inside an artillery shell, specifically, one with a diameter of only 280 millimeters or 11 inches, was a task that bordered on alchemy. It required a complete revolution in physics, engineering, and materials science. The core innovation was the concept of the linear implosion system. The bomb that destroyed Nagasaki used a complex spherical arrangement of explosive lenses to crush a plutonium core to critical mass. This was far too bulky for a narrow artillery shell. So the physicists at Los Alamos devised a new, radical design. They would assemble a series of subcritical rings of fissile material, like donuts on a stick, inside the shell casing. At detonation, a conventional explosive charge would fire these rings down a tube, slamming them together into a single, supercritical mass at the other end. It was, in essence, a gun firing a nuclear bullet inside another gun. This breakthrough was the heart of the W-9 nuclear artillery shell. It was a marvel of miniaturization. It weighed only 600 pounds, yet it could deliver a yield of 15 kilotons, the same explosive power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was a city killer that could be fired from a cannon. This was the source of the impossible power that so baffled the Soviet analysts. They were looking for a new chemical explosive, never imagining that the very physics of the weapon was different. The microchip had defeated the smokestack. But the shell was only one part of the system. An equally impressive feat of engineering was the device built to fire it, the M65 atomic cannon. It was not a single weapon, but a mobile artillery platform. It consisted of two massive, 50-ton tractor trucks, one at the front and one at the back, with the 85-ton gun carriage slung between them. This 200-ton behemoth could travel on roads at 35 miles per hour, set up to fire in 15 minutes, and then pack up and move before the enemy could retaliate. It was designed for a new kind of war, a shoot-and-scoot nuclear battlefield. This hardware was then integrated into a new doctrine. The American Army was reorganized into what were called pentomic divisions. These were leaner, more mobile formations designed to operate in a dispersed fashion on a nuclear battlefield. They were built around the concept of delivering tactical nuclear fire. The M65 cannon was their sword. It gave a division commander the ability to destroy an enemy army with a single command. This was the final piece of the puzzle, a philosophy of war that embraced tactical nuclear weapons not as a last resort, but as a core component of battlefield operations. The impossible event was not just a new shell. It was the seamless integration of miniaturized nuclear physics advanced mechanical engineering, and a revolutionary military doctrine. It was a system that the Soviets, with their compartmentalized, top-down approach, could not even conceive of, let alone replicate. They were trying to understand the Fong, without ever comprehending the existence of the snake. The breakthrough for the Soviets comes not from a brilliant piece of analysis, but from a stroke of luck. A defector, not a high-level general or scientist, but a mid-level technician who worked in the ordnance depot in West Germany that serviced the new atomic artillery units. He is not a physicist. He cannot explain the theory, but he is a meticulous man with a photographic memory. He brings with him something more valuable than any single document. He brings the process. In a safe house in East Berlin, over dozens of hours of intense debriefing, he draws. He sketches the internal layout of the W9 shell from memory. He draws the strange, ring-like components. He draws the gun barrel inside the shell. He describes the incredibly precise handling procedures, the use of white gloves, the constant temperature monitoring. He doesn't know why these things are done. He only knows that they are. To the GRU officers, it is gibberish. But when they transmit the drawings to the nuclear physicists at the Artemis 16 research city, a horrified silence descends upon the laboratory. They understand immediately. It is not a chemical reaction. It is a nuclear one. The rings are uranium. The internal barrel is a gun-type assembly. It is a fission device. The shock wave that hits the Soviet high command is more powerful than any physical blast. It is a psychological implosion. The first layer of shock is technological. The Americans can build a nuclear bomb small enough to fit inside a cannon shell. This capability is so far beyond their own efforts at miniaturization that it seems like black magic. Their own tactical nuclear devices are still enormous, clumsy bombs that require specialized aircraft. The second layer is industrial. As their engineers study the defectors' drawings, a deeper horror sets in. They realize they cannot build this. Not now. Maybe not ever. The design requires machining tolerances they cannot achieve. It requires alloys they cannot reliably produce. It requires a level of quality control and precision manufacturing that is simply absent in their state-run, quota-driven industrial base. To build one, as a laboratory prototype, might be possible. To mass-produce thousands, to the exacting standards required for a reliable nuclear weapon, is an industrial fantasy. The command economy, so effective at churning out crude, simple tanks by the tens of thousands, is constitutionally incapable of producing such a sophisticated and delicate instrument of war. The third layer of shock is the most profound. It is philosophical. They finally understand. The Americans were not trying to build a better version of a World War II weapon. They were building a World War III weapon. All of the Soviets' wrong conclusions, all of their futile countermeasures, are laid bare. They were reinforcing their armor to stop a bigger explosion, when the real threat was radiation and a blast wave that made armor irrelevant. They were dispersing their forces to hide from a kinetic weapon, when the real weapon was designed to punish and erase those very concentrations. Their entire intellectual framework for understanding warfare was obsolete. They had been preparing for the last war, while their adversary was preparing for the next one. They weren't just behind in technology, they were behind in imagination. Despite the sickening realization of their own industrial inadequacy, the order from the Premier is unwavering. Copy it. Screw for screw, it is an order born of political necessity and deep-seated ideological pride. To admit they cannot match the Americans is to admit the failure of their entire system. So begins a gargantuan, ruinously expensive, and ultimately doomed effort to reverse engineer the American Phantom. The best scientists and engineers are assigned to the project. They work under immense pressure, with the threat of failure hanging over them like a guillotine. They manage to build crude prototypes, but the devices are unreliable. They are too heavy. The yields are inconsistent. During one test, a prototype shell gets stuck in the breech of their own experimental cannon, creating a terrifying standoff that lasts for 3 days as technicians delicately try to extract a live, armed nuclear device. The project is a catalog of failures, each one highlighting a deeper systemic flaw. It is a hawk trying to catch a rat in a burrow. The attempt to copy the American hardware without understanding the underlying system of innovation, quality control, and decentralized problem-solving is a catastrophic failure. They can copy the shape of the machine, but they cannot copy the culture that created it. The project burns through billions of rubles and years of effort, diverting precious resources from other critical areas. The feudal copy becomes a monument to their own systemic weakness. It is a perfect, gleaming replica of a machine whose soul they could not capture. The final, brutal verdict on this technological chasm is not written on a battlefield. It is written in the classified annexes of wargame reports conducted by both sides. In NATO simulations, the results are consistently, terrifyingly lopsided. A single battalion of atomic artillery, 9 M65 cannons, is judged capable of halting an entire Soviet front, a force of several armies, hundreds of thousands of men, and thousands of tanks. The projected exchange ratios are not 10 to 1, or even 100 to 1. They are infinite. The Soviet force is annihilated before it can even engage the enemy in a conventional battle. For the Soviet marshals, these numbers are the true face of their humiliation. Their entire military edifice, the largest land army ever assembled in human history, is a glass hammer. It is immense, powerful, and utterly brittle. It is designed to fight a war they can no longer win. The deployment of a few dozen tactical nuclear artillery pieces in Western Europe has checkmated their primary strategic asset. This specific military encounter was a symptom of a much larger historical trend. The M65 cannon and its W9 shell were early, dramatic manifestations of a fundamental divergence between East and West. The Western Alliance, led by the United States, was leveraging its advantage in information technology, miniaturization, and precision manufacturing. It was moving from an industrial-age military focused on mass and brute force to an information-age military focused on precision, systems integration, and information dominance. The Soviets, trapped in a rigid, centralized command economy, were still fighting the last war. They could produce more tanks, more guns, and more soldiers. But they were falling behind in the technologies that truly mattered: microelectronics, computers, and advanced materials. The core lesson was brutal and inescapable. The failure was not one of intelligence or courage. It was a failure of the system itself. A system that prioritized quantity over quality, imitation over innovation, and centralized control over decentralized empowerment was destined to lose a long-term technological race. The atomic cannon did not just threaten to destroy Soviet armies. It exposed the deep, systemic flaws that would eventually lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. It was proof that a command economy could not compete with the dynamic, chaotic, and ultimately more innovative engine of a free market system. The microchip had defeated the smokestack. The legacy of this technological shock was profound and lasting. It accelerated the nuclearization of the Cold War battlefield. The Soviets, unable to match the American tactical nuclear systems directly, responded in the only way they could, with mass. They developed their own tactical nuclear weapons, but they were cruder, higher yield, and designed for battlefield saturation. This led to the terrifying doctrine of a European land war where thousands of tactical nuclear weapons would be used by both sides, creating a radioactive wasteland from the English Channel to the Ural Mountains. The M65, designed to prevent a conventional invasion, ironically made a nuclear war more likely by lowering the threshold for their use. It was a monster created to slay a giant, which then gave birth to a whole new generation of monsters. The weapon itself, the great M65 Atomic Annie, had a short service life. It was large, clumsy, and soon superseded by more advanced systems like nuclear-capable cruise missiles and fighter bombers. But its impact was seismic. It was the first clear signal that the nature of power had changed. It was no longer simply about the number of divisions or the tonnage of steel a nation could produce. It was about the sophistication of its ideas, the precision of its machines, and its ability to integrate complex systems of technology and doctrine. The cannon was a laser beam of heavy metal, a physical manifestation of a new logic of war. It taught the Soviet Union and the world a terrifying lesson. The most powerful weapon is not the one that makes the loudest noise, but the one that forces your enemy to question everything they thought they knew about how to fight, how to win, and how to survive.